Tim, good to see you, man.
Yeah, nice to see you.
We've been friends now for a long time, I think like 15 years or so.
Yeah, at least 15.
And you've been a huge part of the Shopify story, but I want to start at the beginning, which is in 2009 or so, we met and you gave us this great piece of advice for Shopify. We were a small little company at the time. We were trying to make it more easy for people to build beautiful online stores. And the initial advice you gave us was, guys, this is cool, Shopify is great, but most people don't believe that entrepreneurship is accessible. Can you talk a bit about where that advice came from? Because I want to start in that first sort of conversation.
Sure. There are financial hurdles, there are technical hurdles to becoming an entrepreneur, depending on what you want to do, of course. And then there are the social, psychological hurdles, some of which are based on your current belief system. And at the time especially, and I need to give credit where credit is due to my readers because I had polled them.
This is before our work week.
Yeah, asking how they would revise and update the 4-Hour Work Week for the edition that came out in 2009. And Shopify came back over and over and over again, which is how it ended up on my radar, then met Toby. That's how the conversation developed. So it all comes kind of full circle with my readers. And the ease of use of Shopify and the degree to which it was recommended led me to have the conversation with you guys. I saw, okay, this is easy to use. People assume it is hard to use. So you can't just assume you're going to have a huge funnel of people trying it who will then convert to long-term users. You have to get them to take that first step. And one of the most effective ways to do that is just to bribe them.
Yeah,
basically.
And that's what we did, right?
And incentivize is a nice way to put it.
And the bribery sort of came through this idea of the build a business competition, which had one simple rule: start a brand new business on Shopify, and the store with the most sales after 6 months would win. I think it was $100,000, which we did not actually have at the time.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it was a big number.
Yeah, it was a big number.
Nice round number.
We wanted to do 10,000. You're like, sorry guys, it's 100,000.
Yeah.
And telling a small little startup that they have to give away $100,000 is kind of insane.
Oh, I remember the conversation. Yeah. I remember so specifically. I don't know if I ever told you this. I was walking around a place called Osha Thai in Glen Park in San Francisco, and I walked out to the curb because it was loud in the restaurant. I remember exactly where this conversation took place.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that has led to some of the greatest companies that build a business competitions, created companies like Nixware and Gymshark came out of it. And obviously I think the first one was Dodo Case. But it's been a huge part of our mission now, which is that it's great to have the best software, it's great to have the best technology to allow people, enable people to build businesses. But you need to also give them a bit of a kick in the butt to say, this is okay. You have permission to go and try something really crazy.
And education, in fairness, right? You guys offering tools and advice along the way. Because it's one thing to give somebody a hammer, but if you ask them to build a house, like you need some type of plan.
Totally.
You need some type of set of fundamental skills. Yeah. So I think that combination is super important.
16 years ago, you wrote The 4-Hour Work Week. Right, 4-Hour Work Week, right. I think the other ones came after, but 16 years ago. If you were to write The 4-Hour Work Week today, would there be anything in particular that you would say, okay, this is like totally not the right thing anymore? Or has most of the content and the lessons in there, is it timeless?
I would say, certainly based on current sales, because the book still does really, really well.
Wow.
That the principles and the philosophies that I view as the most important basis for the entire perspective shift in the book are all valid, because those are really gathered and assembled from really old traditions like Stoicism, also pulled from people like Drucker. Those have lasted a long time. They existed before I wrote the book. They will continue to be valid. The really specific tactical tools and technologies have evolved a lot. So rather than trying to say, look at a newsstand, identify various markets that overlap with your target demographic and figuring out the circulation and so on and negotiating remnant ad rates for some type of full page ad in XYZ magazine, there are, of course, tools online that allow you to do that in a much more direct, cost-effective way and time-effective way. Often the same thing. So I would think update the tools, which begs the question, why haven't I done it?
Yeah.
And I've thought about doing this. The issue there is that the tools, the very specific tactics and tools change so quickly. There are certain core infrastructure pieces that haven't changed that much. But Shopify would, of course, still be in there. But a lot of the analytics, a lot of the various ways someone might propagate their message, try to market, reach audience, TikTok, et cetera, right? If Vine had gone in there, I would need to then revise 12 months later.
That's right.
And then I would need to revise 12 months later again. And I prefer to provide the principles and the guiding tenets. And I say, look, guys, if you can't figure out how to at least do a handful of searches on Google and find these 6 things, maybe this isn't for you.
Right, but in terms of the vehicle to do that, you were agnostic to whether or not it's MySpace or it's TikTok.
Totally.
The tactics are the same.
Yeah, it's like if you have a paintbrush, a pencil, charcoal, you still need to know how to draw or sketch. The fundamentals are the same.
For me, one of the things that came out in the 4-Hour Work Week, which I think was one of the most timeless lessons, was the way that you approach challenges. And some people sort of articulate it as sort of the 80-20 rule that I think you are now well connected to and frankly have become famous around. But how would you approach problems differently today relative to how you approach problems 16 years ago? Or is it stayed exactly the same?
Problems within the realm of entrepreneurship?
That's right. In terms of starting a business, scaling a business, building a business.
I would say that most recommendations would be the same. Not to sound like a broken record, but if you haven't read 1,000 True Fans by Kevin Kelly, read it again.
Yeah.
And if you think you got it, read it again.
Yeah.
And if you haven't read The Law of Category within the Immutable Laws of Marketing, even though some of the advice is outdated in the book, read it again. And that said, I would probably add that when we were initially having a lot of our first conversations, building a business was difficult on a bunch of levels related to logistics, maybe related to capital. Now, I think one of the larger challenges is attention. Many of the barriers have been removed. So the question is not simply, how do I build the undergirding support system for a business because I know exactly how to reach my audience, but rather, how do I do that? How do I build a great product? I do think product differentiation has become more and more important as more and more people can private label, drop ship, have others handle fulfillment, et cetera. And then also, how do I actually separate myself from all the noise or cut through the noise to convert people to XYZ product or service that I'm offering? I think that is underestimated by a lot of folks. And the golden age of, say, Google AdWords in the beginning, where it was just like fish throwing themselves in the boat.
Yeah, right.
Those days,
if you had money, you were able to buy the keyword you want.
Exactly.
Right. But you talk about attention, and I think one of the things that we're sitting here in the Shopify Creator Mart, where you have these content creators, primarily content creators, who then expand their business and actually build great products. You're sitting right in front of Feastables, for example, from Mr. Beast.
The Beast.
Which is, what Jimmy has built there is unbelievable. But it feels like something is sort of reversed. Previously, you would start by building a product and then find the audience. When you kind of look around here, you see all these amazing products. First, these great entrepreneurs first had an audience and then created products afterwards that was appealing, that was interesting to their customers or their audience. But they did so in a way that doesn't feel promotional. And I think back about some of the early kind of celebrity endorsements, and it felt a little bit like a white label. J-Lo for Macy's. No disrespect to J-Lo, but did J-Lo actually create the clothing that was being sold in Macy's, or did some third-party intermediary say, we're going to buy your name, put it on these clothing? In many ways, I sort of view you as one of the original. You're going to sort of roll your eyes at this, but one of the original content creators. I mean, you had a podcast before anyone else did. You were doing these blog posts before anyone else did. And you also found that, hey, my audience cares about this stuff. Maybe it's cooking. I'm going to create the 4-Hour Chef from that. Can you talk a little bit about how you see content creation as the OG content creator evolving?
Sure. I want to maybe make a comment that I think is really important before I launch into that, which is, you can create an audience, and a lot of people are creating audiences now and then hoping to convert those to some type of business or a revenue stream. I would just be very cautious of how you approach that, because if you're going to be the wear a unicorn hat and talk about lollipop guy, what if that goes well? If that goes well, all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, I'm on a YouTube channel that requires me to be the unicorn hat lollipop guy forever.
Yeah.
And also with social and the various incentives that are all created by very smart people and PhDs and data scientists, or with the input of data scientists at these various companies, you will get shaped by your audience to be the most exaggerated form of yourself. And that can go exponential and get strange very quickly. So
Did that happen to you?
It did not happen to me because I was, number one, aware of it from the outset. And I would very deliberately make decisions that were counter to growth, which might sound very strange.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think about growth, I think about sustained endurance, doing something that I'm intrinsically interested in.
Durable.
So the way I wrote my podcast, the way I wrote my blog posts, 1,000 plus, the way I've approached my podcast is all related to personal interest, which gives me a huge competitive advantage because I can sustain it for a very long period of time. I'll give you an example. When I looked maybe 2 years ago at my top 25 podcast episodes for the year. Mm-hmm. In the top 5, I think 3 were very crypto focused.
Wow.
Or had a large crypto component, right? They weren't inherently just about crypto, but featured guests who were talking
Biology
about
or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And there was pressure, I wouldn't say pressure, but a number of people who were looking at this data set said, got to do more crypto. You'll kill it. Yeah. You'll kill it. And I said, I want to be very careful about how strongly I bend the curve of my audience in terms of demographic and psychographic. Because if I have that heavy concentration, I'm not just going to attract a certain audience, I'm going to repel a certain audience or just alienate a certain audience. And I think that's a very short-term high. And I mean, in retrospect, it certainly would have been.
Yeah. But not durable.
So rather than not durable, and also if I succumb to that, in other words, here's my top 25, the top 4 are this, we're going to triple down on this. I'm setting a precedent that I will likely follow in the future. And that means I'm no longer proactively choosing things that are aligned with my personal interests, which I think is one of the key secret ingredients to everything that I've done, is just doing something you can do continuously and with enough wiggle room that you can also innovate within your kind of category. So
there's an underlying tone of authenticity in there as well.
Yeah.
That, hey, like I will talk about crypto when I think my audience is interested. I'll talk about, generative AI when I think my audience is interested. But generally, I'm going to be authentic to what I think is interesting, what my audience might care about.
Oh, it's got to be, for me, 100% what I am interested in, first and foremost.
Yeah.
Because then you have a guaranteed audience of 1.
Right.
Which is also how I wrote the books.
Right.
And
I guess it's it's not Kevin Kelly's 1,000 true fans. It's like Kevin Kelly's like 1 true fan.
Single true fan.
Single true fan.
Right. Make it for yourself.
That's right.
And that might sound very naive, but I assure people, having not just 100+ friends and hundreds of people on the podcast who would probably fit into the description of content creator on some level, but also thousands and millions of fans who are also making attempts, I see patterns. And if you try to, as an example, out this American life,
not going to work.
You should listen to the credits at the end.
Oh,
because
it's 30 people, right?
It's 30 people.
Yeah. I want to thank this person. It's insane.
And you will end up in the elephant graveyard of dead podcasts that had 3 episodes,
right?
Which is the vast majority. So, and I would also suggest, this is just maybe not specific to podcasts, but to many different platforms, don't make an open-ended forever commitment. So when I started the podcast, I said to my existing audience, which a lot of people skip over the blog as a tool for having built that audience. The blog was a critical step, and it still exists, 1,000+. When I started the podcast, I said to my audience, and I might get the number of episodes wrong, but I'm doing this experiment for 6 episodes. I'm going to see if I like it. If I like it, I'll keep doing it. If I don't, it's just kind of a mini series of 6 episodes. Thanks for putting up with it. And here we go.
Wow.
And that gave me a graceful exit.
Sure.
So I think that's also a key component to not just content creation, also business deals. Like, what is the termination clause? Have you thought through what that looks like?
Right. Because otherwise, there's sort of an easy sort of exit, and now you can go back to your blog, and it's sort of it all feels like the audience can expect that to happen.
Yeah.
And I think actually, when you on the topic of authenticity, I think what a lot of content creators are trying to do now with sort of extending their brand is sometimes they're extending into areas that just don't make any sense.
Yeah.
One of the interesting stories about Feastables in particular, because I'm staring at them right now, is that Jimmy actually has Crohn's disease.
Yep.
And Feastables, the chocolate bar, was actually something that he wanted for himself.
Yep.
Airrack really does love pizza, and he wanted everything to taste like pizza, so he created this pizza sauce.
Yeah.
When you think about the brands that are created by content creators that are the most successful, there's a direct relationship between the actual creator and the brand itself. It doesn't feel like, Brad Pitt used to have, I kid you not, in the 80s, he used to endorse toothpaste. And so one of the famous stories of
That's nice teeth.
He has great teeth, but should Brad Pitt be actually connected to toothpaste? I'm not really sure. I'm curious also around.
He did jeans in Japan too. A lot of people don't know.
Jeans in Japan?
Oh yeah.
I mean, maybe that is the right thing, but one other thing that I'm always, your authenticity is in as someone that knows you both as a partner at Shopify, but also as a good friend. Your authenticity, I think, is something that I really have always admired about you. The other thing that I really admire about you and have since I met you many years ago is your curiosity. And one of the things that I've noticed is that some folks, when they get more famous and they create a lot of content and build massive communities, their curiosity fades a little bit and they begin to sort of recycle what has already worked. You talked a bit about this with crypto, but your curiosity, I mean, I've been listening to the last couple of podcasts you've done, your podcast, and there's like a new theme, for example, that you've been talking about, like sleep.
Yep.
Clearly, sleep is something that you care about personally. Mm-hmm. Clearly, it's also something you find is compelling and interesting. But how do you keep your curiosity so alive as you scale, as opposed to kind of let it meander?
For me, it's like curiosity or die, by and large. Because why are you building? Let's return to maybe some of the basic questions that prompted someone to build an audience or start a business. If you're building an audience, creating content, starting a business, you're probably doing those things to ultimately produce a set of feelings. And maybe you're acquiring things or having experiences by paying for those things with money, and then those convert to a feeling. Maybe it's a feeling you get from your audience directly. But the feeling is probably one of aliveness. Mm-hmm. And if you get to a point where you have enough critical mass of X, whatever that is, where you feel like you have to move from being offensive and testing new things to being defensive and protecting whatever you have, mm-hmm. you're going to minimize and certainly diminish all those feelings that were kind of the goalposts that you set out for in the first place. So I do think the experimentation is super key.
Do you think that over time, that curiosity is something like, do you have to keep coming back and thinking to yourself, okay, what in my life right now do I want to share with my audience? Or like, how did the sleep thing is very personal to you.
Yeah.
So it's an obvious extension. But how do you encounter new things, and like, how do you discover new things to be curious about?
For me, curiosity is a function of, I think, a few things. Understanding that there's a reward, at least for me, for that curiosity. Like, good things tend to happen. Interesting things tend to happen that keep my life feeling alive. I know that sounds strange. But
no, it doesn't. It sounds amazing.
Like, what is full aliveness to you? I'm posing that to everybody. It could be different. For me, encountering new, exciting things, and exciting could just be they prompt a whole host of questions that are interesting to me, is a byproduct, and this is not accidental, of engineering serendipity by interviewing people on the podcast from a million different areas. Right? It's not just business.
Yeah.
But it's not just science. It's not just art. It's everything and anything that I happen to be interested in, and how those things recombine. So that, I think, is...
So is that a hack then? I mean, is the podcast, it's this amazing thing. It creates so much value for the listeners. Is it also a hack for you to remain curious and be able to go deep into different areas?
It's just for me.
It's just for you.
It sounds... No, it sounds maybe strange, but I have learned over time that the way I best serve my audience is by genuinely following my own interest. Because if I am feigning interest, and I've done it a few times where podcasts have gone off the rails really early, not now.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I just have to like nod and smile and go along with this.
And it never
It's
works.
Obvious.
Yeah,
Even if people can't name it, they're like, something's off. Yeah. It's weird. And I would also say on the integrity side or the authenticity side, I think being authentic is important for 1,000,001 reasons, but authenticity is also self-interested. If you're not authentic, you now have an act to remember. You now have theater to reenact. Now you have something that is energetically costly, that isn't quite you, that you have to replicate or are going to feel compelled to do over and over again. And that is going to ultimately hurt you. It's going to kill your endurance. And it's also going to be obvious to a lot of audience, even if they can't put a finger on it. So I would say authenticity, really sticking to your true interests, curiosities, loves, is the ultimate competitive advantage.
There's a lineup of people outside that want to get in here right now to ask a bunch of questions before they do, because it's about to get really loud. So for anyone who's watching or listening to this digitally, you'll notice that there's going to be a change in tone here. But before we let these people in, one thing I was going to ask you is this: you have had a chance, unlike most people on the planet, to meet some of the greatest minds, the most interesting thinkers, the greatest doers, the most accomplished people, and you have compiled some of those lessons and advice into Tribe of Mentors, which I think is one of the great books for any entrepreneur to read. Frankly, I think Tribe of Mentors, maybe you don't describe it this way, but for me, it's a reference book that I don't have to read the whole book. I can actually jump around and say, what did this particular person say? Curious, what is the greatest advice, if you can pick anything random, it doesn't have to be the greatest, but like one piece of advice you got that you're like, this was amazing from that book. And then I'm going to flip it around. What is the best advice you believe you've given someone else? So maybe start with the best advice you've received from all the people that you've interviewed, if you can.
Yeah, I would have expected that I'd be immediately stumped because the search function is just too hard.
Yes. With how many episodes?
700, something like that. And they're not the shortest conversations generally. But
you wouldn't say that my episode was the one that actually stood out to you
so Harley,
more than anything
I have to tell you, there are 3 lines from you. Also, strong episode. I'd say the piece of advice that hops to mind, which may or may not be in Tribe of Mentors, but if not, it's probably in Tools of Titans, that I received and would also give, that I think it's so fundamental that I'll use it here. And it was actually the answer from Dr. B.J. Miller, who's a hospice care physician, triple amputee, who has helped more than 1,000 people, probably thousands now, to transition to death.
And hospice is where you go right before you're about to pass.
That's right. Okay. So he's been with 1,000+ people as they've gone from alive to dead, and has shepherded them through that process with a team as well. And he answered my billboard question, what would you put on a billboard? And he said, well, I'm going to give you an answer. I think I got it from a bumper sticker. And I was like, okay. And it was, don't believe everything that you think. It's very simple, right? But if you sit with it, don't believe everything that you think. It's a really profound rule and hard to follow, but we all have stories, right? I am this, I am not that. I can do this, I can't do that. My parents did this, that's why I'm this way. In relationships, I behave this way. Whatever the set of beliefs might be, and I would just say, don't believe everything that you think. Interrogate your beliefs, because the beliefs are thoughts you take to be true. And if you actually sit there and make a list of, say, counter evidence and evidence for, and use something like Byron Katie's The Work to do what are called turnarounds on these things, you realize that many of them just have no real basis in reality. So I would say, don't believe everything that you think. And that applies absolutely to content creation. It applies to business building, content creation. With the blog, when I started, people said they get the blog post must be 500 words or less.
Right.
People aren't going to read long form. Turns out, nonsense.
I mean, how long was your longest podcast? Is how long?
Longest podcast is probably 4+ hours.
4+ hours.
And then you have someone like Tim Urban at Wait But Why, who's amazing. His longest blog post series is about 70,000 words.
Right.
It's longer than most books. And so just be very cautious of which beliefs you hold on to really dearly. So I would say, Don't believe everything that you think.
What I love about that also is, as an entrepreneur, I think we're all kind of set in like, here's how I'm going to build my business. Here's what I'm going to create. Here's who my audience is. And by having a little bit more flexibility with your own self-identity around, or your business's identity, you get to do really cool shit. You can create the biggest burger chain in America if you're Mr. Beast, which 5 years ago you would have thought that was sort of crazy.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would say, and this may also seem really simplistic, but you're going to have your ups and downs, especially if you choose the entrepreneurship route. You are going to have ups and downs, and your ups and downs are going to be magnified more so than probably most people in a job. But if you have too long a period where you're waking up with some degree of anxiety and having a lot of trouble going to sleep, pay attention. Maybe there's something that you should tweak. Maybe there's an experiment you should run. Because if you carry those feelings for too long, you are not going to have the sustainability necessary to do well, deliver good things, whether contents or services to people. And that is sort of the path of diminishing returns.
Yeah. I love the idea of sort of, if you have an idea, this idea of like, you're in the shower, you have this crazy thought, you put it aside, you have it in the shower the next day, you put it aside. What's really cool about like modern times and business creation, modern times entrepreneurship generally, is that you can just try it.
Yeah.
And if it works, you may become the next Gymshark or the next Allbirds, the next whatever. And if it doesn't work, the cost of failure is trending so close to zero that it almost doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I will say, just to reiterate, because I think it's something that I've made a rule for myself. If you don't set expectations for your audience or customers publicly, there's a chance that when you try something, you will have such loss aversion, or you'll succumb to sunk cost fallacy in such a way that you'll feel like you have to continue.
Yeah.
And so one of my tricks, it's very simple, is, let's just say with writing fiction right now, I'm like, this is exactly what I'm going to do. If it gives me A, B, and C, I might continue. If not, I'm definitely going to stop. And so the expectations are set very, very low.
And it gives you flexibility. Cockpunk may be something that's huge, or maybe...
Or it may not.
You're right.
And it's already given me a lot. And I will just say that whether it's for yourself and certainly for your audience and customers, it's like reality, it's expectations minus reality kind of equals like feeling.
Yes.
So just be aware of that.
Tim, what is one idea or a project that if someone magically gave you more time, 48 hours in a day instead of 24 hours in a day, that you would love to build? What's something that you want to get to, there's simply not enough time? Do you have a shower idea that you keep thinking about? You're like, I wish I had more time to do this thing?
Yeah, animation.
Animation?
Yeah, scripted animation.
Well, you're kind of doing that now, are you not?
I'm doing fiction, which in my mind, I see very cinematically just from having collected comics for a decade as a kid and wanting to become a penciler for so long. I think about it in terms of cuts and sort of panel layout. So it could lead there in the sense that you start with a script and then it moves to something along the lines of formatted, say, screenplay for a comic, which then turns into storyboards, which then turns into animation. These things do take time. I'm not foregoing it.
Okay.
Chance,
you may still do this.
I mean, I would need to know more people who are really, really, really good
at
animation. But that's something that I'd be very excited to explore.
On that same token, before I open up for questions, in the way that you see these creators creating the stuff that they really care about, if you were to create something now,
the only balls you want on your face.
That's what you would do? Oh, great. Yeah,
that's the real tagline, folks.
I believe it's already taken.
Yeah. No, that's already trademarked.
But would you do would it be like, I don't know, like the greatest, hiking backpack of all times, or the most comfortable pair of shoes you can also run in? Like, is there a particular thing that if you had a magic wand, you would just say, I'm going to do that? That's like the Tim Ferriss version of Feastables.
Wow.
Did I just stump Tim Ferriss? I mean, come on, it's kind of impressive.
Probably, what's on my mind, this is going to sound very bizarre, but that's, I guess, kind of my business model. I would say there are some decent options out there, but I would say a tool that is easy to travel with and not excruciatingly painful for psoas release. Something very clever, psoas, probably through the front.
Yeah.
Because so many people suffer from low back pain, yours truly included, which is one of the main limiters on my sleep. And I've been experimenting with all sorts of different options. Most are either so excruciating that you just feel like you're being tortured, and I have a very high pain tolerance that says something, or they're impossible to travel with. So perhaps something like that.
I would buy that. I would buy that. It's a funny story for the crowd. Last time you came to hang out with me in Ottawa, in Canada, you showed up with this spiky like mat, and I picked you up from the airport, and I was like, "What is that?" Because it's this mat, and do you remember?
I know exactly what it is.
And I was like, "What is it?" You're like, "Oh, it's how I relax. It's how I sort of."
Specifically it's a Nayoya acupressure mat, which basically has golf cleats on it that are laid onto this soft mat you can roll up, and you lay on that, which was introduced to me by a Cirque du Soleil performer, former competitive gymnast, whose coach used to require that all of his athletes lay on this mat for 45 minutes after practice.
Wow. I bring bottles of wine when I go visit people. You bring painful mats. So that sums up our relationship in a nutshell. Questions from the audience. Someone want to raise their hand? Someone's got a question? Yeah, you in the back. So I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear.
Hey, what's up, Tim?
Hey.
So, Tim, you've recently got into the world of fiction with Cock Punch. And what I'm curious about is understanding if your creative process coming up with that fictional story, that narrative, how that differs from the non-fiction body of work that you have built so far, or if it's more similar.
Sure. Go for it?
Go for it.
Because we
got the mic.
Yeah, we got the mic. Completely different. I would say, let me revise, not completely different, but very different. So in the case of nonfiction, I'm doing interviews and research to gather all the bits and pieces, which I would typically then organize in something like Scrivener, which I do think is well suited to fiction, but I'm not using it for that just yet. And I would be then doing fact checking and so on. When you're writing about elves and berserkers and so on, you don't do as much fact checking. It has to be internally consistent, but I was still doing a lot of research. So listening to, say, the podcast that was started by Brandon Sanderson and some of his team related to writing and fiction and world building, magical systems and so on. I think it's called Writing Excuses, which are very, very short. I'll warn in advance. There are many of them, 15 minutes each, I think. And studying world builders who sort of set the paradigms or tropes that are still used today by just about everyone, right? So Tolkien, for instance. And really looking at not just the output, so not just, say, Lord of the Rings, but looking at the notebooks of Tolkien. How did Tolkien create languages? A lot of people don't realize. He was very much a hyper-polyglot who fixated on languages, multiple Elvish languages and dialects and so on. So really making a study of that, and then working also graphically first. So I haven't shared a ton of this because I haven't wanted, and I struggle's not the right word. I go back and forth on how to approach this. I haven't wanted to break the fourth wall, so to speak, to be like, hey, this is what I did and how I created Cock Punch. I sort of want people to immerse themselves into it and to be able to be hopefully intoxicated by the characters who are being developed and so on. So I haven't wanted to show too much behind the scenes stuff, but I've started with a lot of drawing and a lot of concept art. And I have Notepad with me right now because I'm planning on doing some writing later today. And it's almost all bird's eye views of different locations or profile views of different characters. So very different. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do it. Like win, lose, or draw, no matter what happens in terms of public outcome, I'm getting to develop new muscles. So mostly different, but some overlap.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice.
Nice to meet you, Tim.
Nice
Alex Edit. First, before I ask my question, I got to tell you, thank you so much for changing my life. The work that you've put out there has changed my life in ways that I can't even explain. And I could talk about that for hours, but I'll ask my question. One of the things that the 4-hour work week has, and if you follow the steps, and by the way, I don't consider it an entrepreneurship book. To me, it's more of a philosophy book.
A life book.
It's a life book. It's a philosophy of a way to run your life. The issue with it is that if you're successful with the book and you're able to accomplish the tasks, you end up very lonely, alone. Like all of my friends, I I go traveling for 6 months. I go, diving for a whole week.
He's really following the steps in this book.
Oh, no. And I really have. Everyone that knows me, especially my brother, he's like, how can you do this? And I'm like, well, here's the Bible. Read it. I call it the Bible. But the thing is, a lot of my circle, I want them to also have this time because that way I'm not so lonely. I'm not alone. I can hang out with them. Totally. How can I convince them? How can I bring them to the dark side and say, look, this is possible? Yeah, you have 80 employees. Like my brother has like 80 employees, but he doesn't own his time. How can you do it? You can. And I see what he does. And I see the areas where he can really do it. How can I bring them to the dark side so that I can have company where
I think it's the light you're trying to bring them to.
Does
that resonate?
Yeah, it does. So thanks for the question and the kind words too. That's what keeps me going because I have my hard days too, as anyone who's followed me knows. This is the biggest challenge. I actually think building businesses, if you're focused and you have a plan and you follow the steps, I don't actually think that's the hard part.
Great.
And if I were to expand or emphasize any chapter in the 4-Hour Workweek, I think the critical piece that gets overlooked is the filling the void chapter, which I'm sure you've read, but it speaks to this. But I do want to validate what you're saying in the sense that literally just a few weeks ago, I was talking to a coach I work with, and I said, one of the biggest challenges I have is simply finding people who can spend time with me doing interesting things. Because if they're successful in building a company, okay, they're CEO, COO, fill in the blank, and they've got all of these people they are accountable to, they feel and may be very obligated to be in one place. And it is a challenge. So this is a challenge. For me, there are a few ways that I've approached trying to solve for this. One is trying to bring people into the same world that you've inhabited. I think that's very hard. And in fact, this may sound silly, but I don't think building a company and having to contend with that uncertainty and such a wide range of options is for everybody. Like some people really benefit from having the scaffolding and the schedule and accountability so that they're not as free-floating. I think that can exacerbate anxiety and depression in a lot of people. The other approach is asking, how can I find or create community? And so that might be people who are fun employed. So, in various ways to find them. It might be volunteering. It might be assembling trips. So for me, a key move has been getting on the calendar, because everybody's busy, generally speaking, or they're going to manufacture stuff to feel busy. Group trips on the calendar. So like every month, every quarter, I have some type of outing with a group. I also focus, so for instance, went skiing recently with 5 very close friends for 10 days. It was blocked out, meals together, skiing together, hiking and touring together. It doesn't have to be that extreme an example. Also group dinners, right? So for the last several days here, I've had game nights. And I'm very interested in games right now, tabletop games and card games and so on. So we've been testing, say, 3 to 6 different games each night with someone who really understands game design. Super fun. And therefore, even if I am isolated or alone for the majority of the day, I have that, and it ends up being this social life raft. So those are some of the ways that I've tried to approach it. But the question you're asking and what you're trying to solve for, I think is one of the most overlooked and one of the most significant challenges for anyone who actually creates a ton of freedom in a world where most people do not create that much freedom, or perhaps subconsciously don't want that degree of freedom. It's very challenging.
It is, I think, the most important part of the book. I mean, if you're able to achieve the rest, that's the part that I pay no attention to, because I'm reading this like, what is this guy talking about? There's no way this is going to happen. Yeah. And now, you know.
Yeah. One thing that I have learned from Tim, he sort of talked about the ski trips and his game nights, but Tim is a ritual guy. You have incredible rituals. And some of the rituals that I think you instituted when I first met you 15 years ago are still rituals today.
Yep.
I used to see you every single year at an event. I won't say the event's name, but I used to, and it was sort of like, oh, well, this is where I see Tim. And, and at some extent, myself and actually Toby, we used to go to this event just to hang out with our buddy Tim because it was a place we all knew we were going. Yep. And I actually think that type of ritual is really, really important. You can say to your brother, look, twice a year, we're going to do this trip and we're going to bring these people as well. But I think that gets overlooked. Thank you for the great question.
Yeah, and a few times a week, group exercise classes also. That's very helpful in my case. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah,
nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Hey.
Tim, Harley, great to meet you both.
Great to meet you.
Two-part question.
What's your name?
Chris.
Hey, Chris.
I run a startup called Convictional. We're in the Shopify ecosystem.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate it. Absolutely. I'm wondering if you guys can talk about the origin story behind the Build a Business competition and what are the generalizable lessons that have stood the test of time that apply to founders running early stage startups?
I'd be curious to hear your perspective. I mean, I have one knee-jerk thought, which is that was a little bait and switch. Sorry, Harley.
That's okay. Wait a second.
Now I've had two cups of coffee. Wait a second. I got to really.
Can you answer the question? I'll answer it first, though.
Enough about me. Let's hear from you. No, actually,
that sums up the entire friendship in a nutshell. Go.
With that attention, you cannot take the next steps. Right? So you need some means of differentiating. I know that you're not necessarily asking about from the Shopify perspective, but without the 100,000, without the ability to separate from the noise with that, I don't think any of the other steps would have mattered. So I do think that applies to not just Shopify, but all the companies that have participated and competed. But I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts.
I mean, the proverbial kick in the butt is probably the most, he's saying the $100,000, which was the original prize, which you weren't here earlier, but we were talking about this at the beginning of this interview. We were going to give out $10,000, and Tim said, no, you got to give out $100,000. In 2010, Shopify did not have $100,000 to give out. And so we were hoping by the end of the competition, we would make enough revenue from the competition that we can actually pay the bounty, the bonus, and ended up going to Dodo Case, who was the first winner. But entrepreneurship, if you don't have people in your life who are entrepreneurs, you don't have a friend group or a tribe of people who are also entrepreneurial, I think the best thing to get people to start businesses, or the big lesson from Build a Business, is most people need a kick in the butt. You can have the best product on the planet, but if there's no incentive to utilize that product, people are not going to use it. In fact, it's the reason why you mentioned, you built an app and ecosystem. There are other apps that you probably look at, you're like, this is not a great app. How are they being so successful? Potentially, their go-to-market is better. I think for us, we realized very early on through Build a Business that even if Shopify is the greatest tool for entrepreneurship on the planet, I think it is, but other people may not, it doesn't matter. What matters is, can we actually encourage people to get started right now? And a great way to do so is to bribe them with a huge prize. Interesting enough, what Tim and I realized in year 2 was some of these businesses didn't need the $100,000. They were making so much money. And so what we did instead was we said, you're going to spend a week in Necker Island with Tim and Richard Branson, or you're going to spend a week going to the Great Gatsby mansion to spend time with, like these incredible mentors and stuff. At a particular time, we realized that the $100,000 wasn't enough. But most people are entrepreneurial or they're creative. They just don't necessarily have they need a little bit of a push to actually get there. And so if you're trying to find ways to get more people to use your products, find some incentive that allows them to sort of push them off the edge in a safe way, but in a way that actually creates some momentum.
I'll add a few things to that just came to mind. So you have the incentive. And then the potential payoff. And I think this is generalizable to most entrepreneurs. Certainly it's generalizable to me, even with my tiny team. I have a very small team. Deadline. Right, so you have a deliverable deadline. So for me, if it's not on the calendar and there isn't a deadline, I just assume it's not going to happen. Like it's just not going to happen. Like I don't know about that. I don't want to speak for everybody here, but it's like I have scraps of paper with like 40 to-dos.
We're all procrastinators here. That's why we're here. We're all procrastinators.
48 of them are never going to happen. Yeah. They're just not going to happen, as optimistic as I might want to be. So deadline, incentive, which is possible payoff, and having quantified that. Deadline on the calendar. And then some type of process with milestones. So I think the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande should be required reading for everyone. And I've read it multiple times. I'm going to continue to reread it. So I do think those other ingredients are really necessary to get the benefit of the incentive with some degree of time pressure and then having milestones and a checklist for accomplishing that.
Makes sense. Thanks, guys.
Right.
Thanks so much for pulling this together. My name's Mike Capetta. I'm from New York City. Tim, you have said how you're a big fan of the Stoicism philosophy, and I'm curious, with all the volatility in the marketplace right now and change, is there anything within the Stoicism philosophy that you're really holding on to that kind of keeps you motivated during these turbulent times?
Yeah, Stoicism. I haven't talked about this in a while. All of it, really. And I think that in some sense, a lot of Stoicism is some version of the Serenity Prayer. Right? It's really being able to separate what you can control from what you can't control. And if anything has been obvious, or at least to me in the last year, it's just how much is outside of my control. And what a fool's errand it can be if you're trying to, say, gain the incremental dollar while spending finite minutes and hours and so on. So I would say for me, the Moral Letters to Lucilius by Seneca the Younger, not to sound like a broken record, but because those short letters are so specific, I find them incredibly useful and timeless. So if Seneca is writing a letter and he's complaining about the noise from the gymnasium and spa downstairs from his office, and he's just bitching and moaning, really, but then trying to put it in perspective and explain how you can contend with such a thing. We're in Austin. It's the Shanghai of the United States. There's construction on 3 sides of my house, right? It's like immediately I can take that and use it. And that's on a micro level. But that is a manifestation of the things you cannot control, including invasion of Ukraine, including collapse of FTX and all that contagion, including fill in the blank. The vast majority of things are outside of our control. And that can, I think, for many people, perhaps lead to a feeling of helplessness. But the way I try to look at it as a huge relief. A lot of things that I just do not need to worry about because worrying about them does no good. And so in a sense, I've tried to look at the volatility as a reminder of how much freedom we have, because there are actually very few things we can or should focus on as levers we can pull. But I do go back and reread those letters a lot.
It also helps with running a public company as well, I should say. There are just some things that are completely out of your control when it comes to macro markets.
Regular reminders.
There's regular reminders of that, but you can control the long-term value the business produces. And I actually think Stoicism is actually, I wouldn't say that I follow the philosophy the way Tim does or the way Toby does, but there are aspects of it I think are super valuable for, frankly, anyone who's in a position that is like hard driving, where there's, turbulence and frankly, entrepreneurship generally has all those things.
Yeah, I would also add to that I think sometimes because I have talked about Stoicism so much, especially in a world that kind of fetishizes public complaining now, you have to be careful what mask you wear, because you sort of become the mask without realizing it. So, and complaining is a route to, I think, unhappiness, broadly speaking. So Stoicism is important for a lot of reasons, and I continue to read it, but it's not the only philosophy. It's not the only philosophy that I read or pay attention to. I mean, I think Epicureanism has a lot. You can learn a lot from Seneca too, who steelmans Epicurus in his letters, knowing that he's kind of his competition in some ways. It's very clever if you actually kind of read between the lines. So I would just say Stoicism is one tool in the toolkit, but it is only one of a handful.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Last one?
Last one.
Last question.
Hey guys, my name's Jake. Thanks for doing this. So I run a blog called Polymathematics, and it's about exploring our multitudes and varying interests. But something I struggle with is, how do you balance that space of tinkering and exploring curiosities with doubling down on one thing and trying to put all your effort in that, since focus is so important for success?
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
I believe,
Mr. High Output Manager?
I believe in the T-shape. I think my role, just to use Shopify for a second, my role at Shopify is effectively, I'm like the chief storyteller of the company. I can do other things too. I was chief operating officer for a while. Was I the greatest chief operating officer ever? I was not. But I didn't really fully embrace the fact that what I really love doing, like it's ikigai almost, right? It's like life's work stuff. What do I love doing? What is the highest impact for the company? And what's something that actually is truly of value to the world? And so what I try to do is like, I got really clear. This is, by the way, in the only last 2 or 3 years. What is my vertical? My vertical, like on the T, is storytelling, is narrative, is explaining to the company, to investors, to merchants, to the public, to media, to everybody. But I also need to understand enough about the rest of the company so that I can actually be effective at that sort of vertical shape. So I've actually doubled down. This is sort of very fresh for me, being a little vulnerable here for a second, very fresh for me in the last couple of years, because I did think that I needed to be a very well-rounded leader at Shopify. And I don't want to be a Riverstone. I actually want to be a very pointy object. I want to work really, really hard on making that point better, which means I may not be able to do all the things that I once did. And I have to be okay with that. And so there is a little bit of like mourning of, well, I'm not doing all these things anymore, but I think the point is getting sharper and sharper. I'm not there yet, but that's been very freeing for me. In fact, I find myself far more productive today than I have in 13 or 14 years being at Shopify, because I'm not trying to be everything to everybody.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And I'm going to answer that, share some thoughts. But before I get there, I want to say I'm not super fond of the term creator. Mm-hmm. Not because it isn't accurate.
It's literally all over the branding, everywhere in this entire space.
I know.
Guys, change it up.
No. But not because it's inaccurate. It's not inaccurate. But I think we can set the bar a little higher. And I was actually going to say this at the beginning of the conversation. I forgot to, and you just reminded me. I think if you currently consider yourself a creator, change that label to storyteller and work on that. Because that, I think, ultimately will probably get far better results.
It's actually it's more practical, too. You actually know what to do.
Yeah. Read Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull.
Yeah.
Read more about the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell. Really study storytelling. Because humans are storytelling machines. Like, if you read Sapiens, that comes through, right? I mean, so really pay attention to that, just broadly speaking. Mm-hmm. To answer your question, I'll answer it personally. Because the temptation for me is always to just become Dr. Octopus with my interests and go in a million directions at once. What I've found is I block out extended periods of time, say a week to 2 weeks, throughout the year for various types of exploration. And that way I know those times are blocked out and I can justify not going in a million directions every day. I don't need to explore every day because I already have these concentrated, dedicated periods that are blocked out. And I have that in my calendar right now for the next 6 months. Secondly, when I look at my week, and I think I initially borrowed this from Jack Dorsey. I don't know if he does this anymore, but rather than saying each day I'm going to do these 6 things in this order, I say in a given week, say on Tuesday, I have team calls. And for lack of a better term, admin, org, logistics work. And it's all batched into, say, Tuesday. And then on Mondays and Fridays, I have podcast recording. For me, the available times are generally 10 a.m., 3 p.m. And I've just refined that over time. Those are the times. They do not move, with very rare exception. And that keeps life easy. A very, very lean team can execute. What that also does is it allows me to say, right now, for instance, a few days a week, up until noon, that's my writing time, which is also my exploration time right now. Like, that's what I'm feeling out. And by looking at my, let's just call it daily routine on a weekly basis, it's not a daily routine, it's a weekly repeating schedule where I'm focusing on one type of task each day, I can also block out exploration time without having it override or negatively impact some of the metrics that we might be tracking. Let's just say average podcast downloads at week 6, plus newsletter subscriber rates, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great question because I think a lot of folks try to do both in an ad hoc way and they get diluted and you don't really do either very effectively.
Yeah. Sweet. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you guys for joining us. This all happened in like a couple of days, and I don't even know how you found out about this thing. I assume Twitter. Yeah, we had Twitter. But this is great. Thank you for joining us. And Tim, I opened by saying, you're the OG creator, but obviously now I'll say you're the OG storyteller. But I tell you this in when we're just the two of us, and I'll say it publicly. Thank you for being an incredible friend to me and Toby, but also being a great friend to Shopify. Shopify, you have your fingerprints all over this company, and we are now, we've now helped millions of stores and entrepreneurs build these incredible things. And I'm not sure we'd be in the same place if it wasn't for you. And so I'm so grateful for your friendship and for your support over the years.
Thanks, Harley.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. So great. So great to be here.
And we're done.
All right.
Buy some cool stuff.
Yeah.